Okay, here's the representative cast of characters for show number 9. We'll start off by hearing about the three greatest Greek philosophers, Socrates, his pupil Plato, and Plato's pupil Aristotle. Socrates wrote nothing, so it's difficult to attribute more than a certain attitude to him. He claimed to know nothing, but since he didn't think anyone else knew anything either, he did make some enemies. One commentator says that all of Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. And in the Middle Ages, Aristotle was known simply as the philosopher. Few men in history have had the kind of influence that Plato and Aristotle have had, and that influence was to be felt not least, as we'll see eventually, by the Christian church. When a saint quotes a pagan more than he quotes the Bible, that's worth noticing. Alexander the Great was himself a pupil of Aristotle, but no one thinks of him as a philosopher today. For 10 years he was engaged in one of the greatest adventures of all time, and after him the Eastern Mediterranean was a changed place. Changed, in fact, to a new era, the Hellenistic era, and one of the most important sculptors of this period of political chaos and artistic greatness was Praxiteles, whose name can represent the visual arts in this list. Okay, that's the cast, and now for the play. In the Athenian Agora, you can see here the location of the Stoa of Zeus, which was one of Socrates' favorite hangouts, and where he would meet informally with anyone interested in philosophy, the love of knowledge. During the last lecture, I mentioned that Socrates was a close friend of the controversial Alcibiades, and he was also at least acquainted with Critias, the leader of the Spartan-imposed government at the end of the Peloponnesian War. Critias had apparently been at least occasionally among those who engaged in philosophical discussion with him. An unfinished dialogue by Plato is named after him, and is well known primarily for its references to Atlantis. Socrates himself, as I said, wrote nothing, and most of what we know about him comes from the memoir of Xenophon the Historian, about whom we also heard last time, and from the dialogues of Plato, in which he serves as the main interlocutor, expressing both his own ideas and Plato's in a way that makes it hard to distinguish one from the other. The pre-Socratic philosophers, as the philosophers before Socrates are called, about whom we heard a couple of lectures ago, were almost exclusively interested in the nature of the world and its physical composition. Socrates and Plato, on the other hand, were much more concerned about things like epistemology, the nature of knowledge, and about morality, spirituality, and how we should live our lives. The typical Platonic dialogue deals with questions like, what is courage, or what is justice, or virtue? Socrates proposes that someone try to define, say, courage, and this will always end in failure, usually because the student will give examples rather than a definition. Courage is standing fast in battle. Courage is following orders, or whatever. No, Socrates will respond. I don't want examples of courage. I want to know what courage itself is. Since a definition which will cover all examples of something like courage and cover no examples which are not examples of what we want to call courage is essentially impossible to put into words, Socrates suggests that the student doesn't really know what it is after all. It's not surprising that more than a few went away angry because of this kind of treatment. What? I'm a soldier who fought with you and Alcibiades at Delion, and I don't know what courage is? Phooey on you, Socrates. Socrates himself claimed to know nothing at all, as I said, so he saw himself as essentially in the same boat with the rest of us. The epistemological view, the essence of the argument here, is that we can't claim to know something unless we can put our knowledge into words. In the foreground now you see the South Stoa in the Agora in Athens, and the Hephaestion in the distance. In between them were the buildings in which the Halaia, or law courts, met, where Socrates was tried. The charges brought against him by Anytus, one of the heroes of the revolution that overthrew Critias, were that he said the sun was a stone, neglected religion, and corrupted the youth with his skepticism. Anytus may also have resented his association with Critias, although Socrates seems in fact not to have been a supporter of his at all. In any case, Socrates presented no real defense, suggesting tongue-in-cheek that he be rewarded for his service to the state. He was given the death penalty, but it's likely he was expected just to go into exile, which was a usual alternative offered. He refused, however, and spent his last days, at least according to Plato, in his customary pastime, in philosophical discussion with the friends who were allowed to visit him while he was in custody. It is in the dialogues which cover this period, the Apology, Crito, and especially the Phaedo, that Plato writes in his most proto-Christian mood. And if you read these dialogues, it'll be easy to see why during the Renaissance Marsilio Ficino mounted a campaign to add these dialogues to the Old Testament. Socrates' whole point of view, what he valued, was, as in the case of Jesus, a condemnation of the way most of his fellow men carried on, and that made him a lot of enemies again. No one likes being shown he's a fool. This is a portrait in the Louvre said to be of Plato. Plato was actually distantly related to Critias, and that, combined with the reaction that led to the execution of Socrates, may have led him and other friends of the latter to leave Athens for some time. In any case, they did leave, and Plato apparently traveled as far as Egypt and Italy before returning to establish his academy, sometimes called the world's first university, outside Athens to the northwest. As I mentioned, it's hard to separate Socrates from Plato in the latter's dialogues, but the usual view is that when Socrates is being skeptical, he's speaking as Socrates, and when he's propounding a solution to a problem, when he's being positive, as it were, rather than negative, then that's Plato speaking. Plato saw correctly, according to most philosophers today, that claiming to know something doesn't commit one to put that knowledge into words. We can recognize courage, for example, when we see it, even if we can't define it. As Plato puts it, this is because we have come into contact with the ideal of courage, courage itself, as it were, and since that can't happen in this life, we must have encountered it in another life. And an epistemological position then becomes a metaphysical one. This is a Roman mosaic depicting Plato with his academy, with his staff, or with maybe some of his graduate students, in effect. I don't know how good an argument Plato thought this was, but there's no doubt that he believed that the soul could be separated from the body to survive it, and that the way to bring this about was, as the Pythagoreans believed, and as St. Augustine and the monks of the Middle Ages would believe, by following rigorous ascetic practice, by freeing oneself from the slavery of the material world. Plato was interested not only in metaphysics, however, but in all the sciences. Theaetetus and Eudoxus of Cnidus, two important mathematicians, were members of the Academy staff, and he was also highly regarded, Plato, for his political and legal ideas, to which his longest dialogue by far, the Republic, is primarily devoted, although it also contains perhaps the most interesting treatment of his metaphysical outlook as well. Aristotle, probably the most universal mind of the ancient world, was his devoted pupil, and we'll hear more about him shortly. This is a relatively rare work of art that can be attributed to Spartan origin, and it's fittingly the image of a soldier. After the Peloponnesian War, the political situation in Greece became very complicated until Alexander the Great brought the whole place, essentially but transiently, under his control. Under King Agesilaus in the 390s, Sparta became involved in a bitter struggle with its former ally Thebes, and finally starved it into temporary submission. But in 371, the Theban hero Epaminondas led a numerically inferior army against the Spartans at Leuctra, about 40 miles northwest of Athens, and defeated it. This is what the battlefield of Leuctra looks like today, with the base of the monument put up by the Thebans still there. This was a turning point in the history of Sparta. Her army had actually outnumbered the Thebans 10,000 to 6,000 and had lost nevertheless. This was essentially the first fair fight the Spartan army had ever lost. And although the reputation of Spartan military expertise lasted until Roman times, Sparta itself was never again a major force in Greek politics. Here again at Delphi, you can see the ruins of the monument erected by Thebes to thank the gods for their victory at Leuctra, the greatest in their history. Unfortunately, although the Thebans defeated the Spartans again at the Battle of Second Mantinea, as it's called, in 362, Epaminondas, their charismatic leader, was killed, and Thebes' own brief hegemony in Greece ended with that. On this map, you can see where Thebes is now, and to the north lies Macedonia. When Epaminondas was in charge, he required hostages from several cities and states to ensure behavior consistent with Theban policy, and Philip, the brother of King Perdiccas of Macedonia, was among them. He actually became good friends with Epaminondas and was trusted to return to Macedonia, where he took over as king on his brother's death in 359. At this time in history, most people in southern Greece, especially in Athens, regarded Macedonia the way people in San Francisco might regard, say, North Dakota, a place of barely literate, near barbarians who eat slabs of meat with iceberg lettuce and huddle together wearing the skins of fur-bearing animals. It's said that Euripides went there to stage some plays, and while walking in the woods was killed by the royal hunting dogs. Under Philip, Macedonia occupied Amphipolis, Olynthus, in a city which was renamed Philippi after him, and this began to worry Athens and other southern cities. This is a statue of the famous orator Demosthenes, who was Philip's most outspoken Athenian enemy, though all most people know about him is that he is said to have cured his stutter by lecturing with his mouth full of pebbles, although it's not clear how this would have helped him much. His denunciations of Philip, known as the Philippics, are among the most famous of surviving Greek orations. The party in Athens which favored accommodation with Philip was led by Aeschines, another famous orator, and they were bitter, lifelong political opponents. Demosthenes was eventually instrumental in the formation of an anti-Macedonian alliance, the main members of which were Athens and Thebes. This is a presumed portrait of Philip, which was found in his presumed tomb at Vergina, and he does look pretty intimidating, although it seems to most modern historians that, contra Demosthenes, his real goal in Greece was to have Athens and the rest of Greece allied with him in a planned invasion of Persian territory. In any case, he was not altogether the barbarian many in Athens thought him to be, despite his harsh treatment of some captured cities. These are some of the ruins of ancient Pella, where Philip was born and which he made the capital of Macedonia. And Athenian architects and decorators were employed on this project, and this is hardly some primitive teepee. And Aristotle, the greatest thinker alive, and who was himself a Macedonian by birth, was hired to be the tutor of his son, Philip's son Alexander. How much Aristotle taught Alexander isn't clear, but all agree that the future world conqueror himself was a very bright and clever fellow. Aristotle wrote on every subject imaginable, although much of what passes for his writing now is thought to be based on student transcriptions of his lectures. Will Durant says, in fact, that he was the first philosopher to write like a university professor, but his students may be the ones to blame for that. For over 1,000 years, he would be regarded as an unchallengeable authority on just about anything animal, vegetable, or mineral, political, artistic, religious, or philosophical. This is thought to be the most authentic portrait of him. One of his most enduring contributions, and one which we still make use of today, is his work on logic, the rules of argument and evidence. He's essentially the inventor of the syllogism, in which a conclusion is drawn from two premises. A typical example would be, all whales are mammals, X is a whale, therefore X is a mammal. This is what's called a valid argument. You cannot accept the premises and deny the conclusion without contradicting yourself. A sound argument is one which is not only valid, but of which the premises and conclusion are also true. Thus, all Athenians are fools, Aristotle is an Athenian, therefore Aristotle is a fool is a valid argument, but not a sound one. Dealing with the rules of logic leads one inevitably to questions about language and meaning too. If I say Shakespeare was the swan of Avon, and all swans have feathers, must I not conclude that Shakespeare had feathers? Aren't all statements either true or false? This kind of issue is still very alive in academic philosophy departments and has been since the Middle Ages. And speaking of the Middle Ages, again, for more than 1,000 years, to medieval Christian scholars, Aristotle was simply, as I mentioned at the outset, the philosopher and almost as important a source for truth as the Bible itself. He was essentially made an honorary Christian through the adoption by the Church of his worldview, and Thomas Aquinas quotes him far more than he quotes the Bible in his monumental Summa Theologica, the last word on theology for its day and for long after. When St. Thomas says that God is pure action, he's not quoting Moses or St. Paul, he's quoting Aristotle. When he says God is greatest in being because he is greatest in truth, again, he says that because that's what Aristotle says. It's Aristotle who is the source of the conception of God as first cause, unmoved mover, and as lacking no perfection. And as recently as 1950, Pope Pius II recognized St. Thomas, who adopted these Aristotelian conceptions as still the surest guide to Catholic faith. In fact, a lot of Christian thought in the Middle Ages can be seen as an attempt to reconcile classicism with Christianity. It was thought that people like Plato and Aristotle, Virgil and Augustus were just too important to relegate to the dark side. And to this day, there's a picture of Averroes, the great Muslim commentator on Aristotle, right on the wall of Pope Julius II's office in the Vatican. And Dante, who was very hard on a lot of Christians, puts most of the classical heroes in limbo, where they just get to lie around on the grass and are punished only by being deprived of the divine vision. But some of us could live with that, I think. So as I mentioned earlier, Athens and Thebes formed an alliance to resist Philip, and when he moved south in 338, with Aristotle's star student and Philip's own 18-year-old son Alexander leading the cavalry, the Battle of Chaeronea took place here, about 30 miles north of Thebes. This is not a well-documented battle, but the Athenians were no match for the Macedonians, and at least 1,000 were killed, while most ran for their lives, apparently including Demosthenes, who'd finally gotten a battle with Philip he wanted. The Thebans at least died more gloriously, and the so-called sacred band, refusing to surrender or retreat, was killed to the last man. And Philip allowed 254 of them to be buried on their battlefield, and the skeletons are still there, where the so-called Lion of Chaeronea is upright again after being knocked to pieces by treasure-hunting Vandals. It was originally erected by the Thebans to honor those who fell here. Everyone in Athens thought that their worst nightmare was coming true. Philip had defeated their army and was doubtless now going to wreck the city and enslave the whole population. Instead, he sent back their cremated dead, returned 2,000 prisoners unransomed, and essentially asked only for Athenian acquiescence in what was a fait accompli anyway, his hegemony over Greece. His leniency was likely motivated in part by his desire to have Athens, and especially the Athenian fleet, on his side in any conflict in Asia Minor. But it was also motivated, I think it's fair to say, simply by his respect for Athenian intellectual and artistic accomplishment. The Athenians, in gratitude, put a statue of him up on the Acropolis, and even Demosthenes, on whom he took no vengeance, admitted, though with a snarl, as J.B. Bury says, that his behavior toward the defeated city was hardly barbaric. Meanwhile, at home, however, things weren't going quite so well. Philip's wife Olympias was from Epirus, more or less modern Albania, and while the Athenians regarded Macedonia as barbaric, Macedonians regarded Epirus as barbaric. This is thought to be Olympias on a medallion. She is said to have been involved in weird religious practice, and Philip once found her in bed with a big snake, which she said was a god. She also claimed that a god, Zeus in fact, was the actual father of Alexander, which is not the kind of thing a husband likes to hear, and it also worried Alexander. Being the son of Zeus might well make him heir to Mount Olympus, but to be the next king of Macedonia, he had to be the son of Philip. Fidelity to one's wife was not required of the king of Macedonia, but Olympias had apparently had her share of mortal as well as divine lovers as well. When Philip proclaimed his marriage to Olympias ended and married Cleopatra, not the famous one of course, but the niece of Philip's general Attalus, and the new queen then bore a son, Alexander may have felt that this was a direct threat to his own rights on the throne.
In the summer of 336, Philip was assassinated in the theater at Igi, modern Vergina, during a celebration there. The circumstances surrounding this assassination and motives for it are far from clear. Alexander, however, certainly benefited from it.
Some believe that probably Olympias and possibly Alexander were behind the plot, but the leading generals of the army immediately declared their loyalty to Alexander in any case, and soon thereafter Cleopatra and her son were killed, apparently on the direct orders of, if not actually by, Olympias. Before Pella was the capital of Macedonia, Vergina was, and in 1977 an amazing find was made there, the still intact tomb of a late 4th century BC member of the Macedonian royal family.
And it is now pretty universally held that Tomb 2 is the tomb of Philip.
Beneath this artificial hill which was raised over it. There are in fact 3 tombs, the unrobbed so-called Tomb of Philip, or Tomb 2, a smaller tomb, Tomb 1 next to it,
which has a
now famous painting on one wall,
and Tomb 3, which had also been robbed. The tumulus seen here from ground level now houses the museum containing the amazing things found in what is apparently Philip's tomb.
Here you can see one of the 2 small gold coffins, about 8 to 10 inches high and a foot and a half or so wide, found in Tomb 2. It has the Macedonian royal sunburst symbol on top of it, and it contained the cremated bones of a middle-aged man, which have now undergone every manner of forensic analysis, which has probably convinced no one of anything of which he was not already convinced before all the lab work. This is the interior of the other casket, which was photographed here before the removal of the bones, which were wrapped in a gold and purple fabric. The bones in this casket are those of a woman of age 16 to 20, which is puzzling if the bones in the other casket are Philip's, because she could be neither Olympias, who lived to be about 60, or Cleopatra, Philip's new wife, whose burial in this tomb would hardly have been permitted. This is the bronze cuirass decorated with gold which was found. While we see some more of the treasure, we're going to hear another version of the second hymn to Apollo from Delphi, this time played on a kithara, accompanied by an aulos. These are greaves, leg armor. This is a quiver. A silver vase. And a spear point. One of the most important things about the tombs is that Tomb 2 and Tomb 1 contain the only surviving examples of ancient Greek wall painting on the mainland. And this picture in Tomb 1, the small tomb, is in much better shape. It depicts the abduction of Persephone by Hades, the central myth of the Eleusinian mystery cult. Consequently, although it may not look like it to the casual observer, this is a subject that is appropriate for a tomb. Before this painting was uncovered, H.W. Jansen wrote that if anything like it were ever found, the style of it would probably be something like the style of Greek vase painting. In fact, however, the style of this is about as far from the linear and hard-edged look of Greek vase painting as it could be. This could almost pass for a sketch by Rubens or some other Baroque painter of the 17th century. It's hard to know how much we can judge from one or two examples, but since this was an important person's tomb, a fashionable painter was likely hired for the job. This now is the so-called Pella head of Alexander the Great. It's called the Pella head because it was found in Pella. As I mentioned earlier, Alexander immediately won the support of the army. But in Thebes and Athens, there were many who thought that as an essentially 20-year-old unknown facing a lot of problems, he might not be able to continue his father's policies. In Thebes, the members of the token Macedonian garrison were put to death, and Demosthenes persuaded the Athenian assembly to issue a decree in honor of Philip's assassin, and his statue on the Acropolis was knocked down. Alexander was not slow to act, however. Within 3 weeks, he was at Thebes and razed much of the city to the ground, with the famous exception of the house of the poet Pindar. Then the Athenians did an about-face, quickly put Philip's statue back up again, and sent an embassy to congratulate Alexander on his victory at Thebes. He reacted with the same leniency toward Athens which had characterized his father's policy. At first he demanded that Demosthenes be turned over to him as the price for sparing Athens the fate of Thebes, but he relented and said he'd be satisfied with whatever punishment the Athenians chose to give him, which was none. It was to the advantage of Athens and Demosthenes that Alexander didn't want to get bogged down in a Greek civil war. He wanted to invade Persia, as his father had been planning to do at the time of his death. To this end, to the end of recruiting something like a Panhellenic force with which to undertake this, he called a meeting at Corinth of the leading Greek city-states. It was at this time that he had his famous encounter with the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic on the steps of the temple there, which we saw a couple of lectures ago. The root of the word cynic is the same as the root of canine, and the point seems to have been that Diogenes was, and his followers were, a sort of dog pack. They needed no more to satisfy them than a dog needs. Diogenes was not only homeless, but clothesless. Nevertheless, he claimed to be wealthier than anyone else, because we should, he argued, measure a man's wealth not by what he has, but by what he needs, what he wants. If you have $1 million, but you want another million, you're the one who's needy, who's dissatisfied. The story goes that when Alexander the Great met him, Diogenes was lying on the steps in the sun, the steps of the Temple of Corinth, Apollo at Corinth. Alexander asked him if there weren't something he, Alexander the Great, could give him, some boon he could grant, and Diogenes just looked up at him and said, "Well, I'm trying to get warm here and you're blocking the sun. Just move aside a bit, please." Diogenes took the asceticism of the Platonic Socrates about as far as it could go. That Alexander would get what he wanted at Corinth was a foregone conclusion, and later that year, 334, with an army of 30,000 infantry and 5,000 horse, he headed east, never to set foot in Greece again. The nominal justification for this was the claim that Greece needed to be defended against Darius III, king of Persia, but this was no more convincing than the similar claim Athens had made to justify its takeover of the Aegean a century earlier. J.B. Bury says that the only lesson the Persians learned from Cunaxa was to hire Greek mercenaries, and Darius had garrisoned most of his possessions in Asia Minor with them. He himself was nowhere near the Aegean at the time of Alexander's invasion. In fact, it's usually claimed that the most difficult fights of Alexander's whole adventure were the early ones in Asia Minor, when he had to face these mercenaries, from whom, even though they didn't win, Darius certainly got his money's worth. Just after crossing the Hellespont, Alexander met his first opposition at the Granicus River, where an army of Persians and Greek mercenaries faced him. But instead of allowing the Greek Memnon the overall command because of the understandable irritation of his Persian generals, Darius sent orders that the command would be divided in a way that could not but create confusion, and the result was the defeat of the Persians and their allies, though whether they would have fared any better with Memnon in sole command is debatable. There are several ancient biographies of Alexander the Great, but none of their authors were anything like contemporary with him. The most valuable and complete ancient account of his life is the one by Flavius Arrianus, known as Arrian, whom we'll hear more about eventually in connection with the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who was a friend of his. Arrian wrote in the 2nd century A.D., but he could draw upon the then still surviving eyewitness accounts of several of those who went on Alexander's great adventure, including Ptolemy, one of his most important generals. He's a bit of a hero worshipper, Arrian, and perhaps sometimes exaggerates, as when he makes the battle at the Granicus River here sound as though it were fought in the Grand Canyon. But if any hero struck people as deserving of worship, as of such personal power that he seemed like a different sort of being altogether, it was Alexander the Great. After his initial victory, Sardis and Ephesus surrendered to him, but Miletus and Halicarnassus had to be stormed. After taking Miletus, he disbanded the fleet which had met him there. This was opposed by some of his generals, who may have pointed out that were Alexander defeated and forced to retreat, it might be necessary to use the ships to get home. But he felt that the fleet would not be sufficient, especially in the face of lukewarm Athenian participation, to hold the coast anyway, and that the way to secure it would be to take all the ports with the army and deny the Persian fleet any access to them in that manner. To some extent he was burning his bridges, but he never seems to have seriously considered the possibility he might lose. The biggest fight in this stage of his campaign was at Halicarnassus, which was defended by the aforementioned Greek mercenary Memnon, who was now given a free hand by Darius. The city was taken, but Memnon escaped and might have caused Alexander real trouble if he had not died soon after this. Alexander then marched back up through Asia Minor to Gordion, which he had appointed as a mustering place, to join with reinforcements coming from Greece. The choice of Gordion was in part dictated by the presence there of the legendary Gordian knot. This is the way the ruins of the ancient city at Gordion look now. The so-called Gordian knot was apparently a hopelessly entangled thing made of woven tree bark, and it had allegedly once been used to attach the chariot of King Midas, he of the Golden Touch, to the yoke thereof. The important thing about it to Alexander was the prophecy according to which anyone who untied it would be destined to rule Asia, and he couldn't resist trying. I don't know what he thought when he saw it, but once he'd committed himself, there was no going back. He may have remembered from his logic lessons with Aristotle that if A is not the same as only if A, that is, that a man who couldn't untie this might be destined to rule Asia nevertheless, but if he couldn't untie it, to fall back on a logical quibble would have been thought unheroic at best. He had to deal with the thing in satisfactory fashion or risk real loss of face. Anyway, after fumbling around with it a few minutes and seeing that it was hopeless, while all of his generals just probably pretended to look the other way, he pulled out his sword and cut the mess in half. Everyone cheered, "Wow, he's done it. He's destined to rule all Asia." There were hurrahs all around, and his reputation rose even higher. The symbolic importance of things like this can hardly be overestimated. If he had failed to deal with the Gordian knot, his career might well have ended with him just Alexander the above average. When Julius Caesar landed on the coast of Africa, chasing the supporters of Pompey, he tripped getting out of the boat and fell flat on his face. This would have been considered a terrible omen, but like Alexander, he could think quickly. He grabbed 2 handfuls of sand and stood up announcing, "As you see, gentlemen, I have tight hold of Africa." From Gordion, Alexander moved southeast and through the undefended Cilician gates, which you see here toward Tarsus. It would have been very hard to force his way had there been an enemy holding this pass. Darius probably would have thought his own army ill-suited to such a defense in any case, however. The Persians liked to fight on the plains and steppes where their numbers were a bigger advantage and their chariots were more effective. In fact, by the time of the Battle of Issus, the Greeks had come 1,000 miles and hardly seen anything of a real Persian army, let alone Darius himself, who was, unlike the short Alexander, 6 feet 6 inches tall and of a godlike handsomeness. The trouble was his heart was too small for one of his royal appearance. He had no charisma, no leadership ability. He was not a genius, but he had to fight one.
The Battle of Issus was fought south of the town of Issus, about where the ruins of the monument called the Pillar of Jonah now stand. The armies of Alexander and Darius had actually passed one another, Alexander going south and Darius going north on the other side of the mountains. When Alexander realized Darius had come through the Ammonic gates behind him, he turned around in the Balan Pass and moved north along the coast toward him. This is the Balan Pass today, looking north. And in this view, you see the Pillar of Jonah at the left, and the battle was fought primarily north of this with the Pinaris River between the two armies. This small stream is likely that river, though there is controversy about this. In any case, this is at least where much of the battle was fought. Alexander going from south to north, right to left in this picture.
Arrian claims that the Persians had 600,000 men against 30,000 Greeks. Most modern historians, however, guess that maybe 100,000 at the most were with Darius. In any case, when pressure was put on Darius himself, he fled the battlefield in his war chariot. Since soldiers tend to lose confidence when their leader abandons them, the flight of Darius led to general consternation and then to the rout of the army. Arrian says only 450 Greeks were lost, but this is hardly credible, even as complete as the victory was. Darius even abandoned his own mother, wife, and children who had accompanied him as though this were some kind of family outing. They probably feared the worst, but Alexander, whom Bury says was naively humane, treated them all with respect. Instead of immediately pursuing Darius, which many of his men thought he should do, and which seems like it would have made sense, he moved down the coast of Phoenicia to secure cities which were either under Persian control or reluctant in any case to accept Alexander's rule. The most important of these was Tyre, and the campaign to take this city, which was then on an island, is among the most memorable of his career. Ultimately, a mole was constructed to it from the mainland, and after 6 months of constant fighting, it fell. The resistance so incensed Alexander that, according to Arrian, the entire population was either killed or sold into slavery. So the humanity he showed to the Persian royal family obviously had its limits. That mole has been widened over the course of the centuries to the point now that it's hard to see that this ever actually was an island. He then moved on into Egypt, where the Persian satrap made no resistance and where he founded what was to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, and one of many to be named or renamed in his honor, Alexandria, or some variant thereof. He also made a difficult 400-mile trip across the western desert to visit the famous shrine of Amun at the Siwa Oasis, where he was proclaimed to be the son of the god, and many of the later images of him show him wearing the ram's horns, which were among Amun's attributes. In the spring of 331, he then set out again for the east, and by early September he was across the Tigris River and found the Persians and their allies drawn up at Arbela, or Gaugamela as it is also called. The numbers are speculative, but it seems clear that Darius' army was even larger than the one he had taken to Issus. Arrian says he had 1,000,000 men, but that's thought impossible, while the army of Alexander, according to Arrian, consisted of 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, which may be reasonably accurate. Again, when pressure was put on Darius, he cracked, fled, and his headless host careened out of control and scattered. After a brief attempt to catch Darius, Alexander turned south to Babylon, which surrendered without a fight, as did Susa, the de facto capital of Persia since the days of Darius I. These are the Persian gates through the Zagros west of Persepolis, which were held against Alexander and his men by Darius's general Ariobarzanes in January of 330. But like the Persians at Thermopylae, Alexander was able to get a force behind the enemy in the pass and attack from both sides. With the victory won here, the Greek army entered Terra Incognita. Alexander did not even know Persepolis, perhaps the greatest royal palace in the world at the time. The Versailles of its day existed. So here it is again. We saw it earlier this quarter when I was talking about Darius I. It was nearly 2 centuries old by the time the Greeks saw it. So that's where we'll take the break and go on with Alexander's adventures after that.